Hi everyone, Caleb Rundell here, and this is your video for Acts chapter 14. Here in 14, some fun and some horrible stuff happens here with gods and stonings as Paul and Barnabas are all over the place in Asia Minor as they bring their first missionary journey to a close. All right, so first we need to talk about some geography. So here is a map of all the places that are mentioned in Acts chapter 14. Now, this comes from just the Wikipedia article on Acts 14, which saves me a lot of trouble from having to make this for you and plot all these places because most of these places now have new names, are no longer exist anymore. So thank you to whoever made this map for Wikipedia, saving us all a lot of trouble. While the map is up here, you will notice again that there are two Antiochs. The first Antioch that we talk about in chapter 14 is the Antioch up north in Turkey in Asia Minor. And the last Antioch that the chapter finishes in verse 26, is the Antioch in Syria. So take a look at that map, get a feel for those place names and how things go. And it will pop up later in the video as well. All right, so to start chapter 14, verses 1 through 7, it says the same things happen here to start 14 as just happened in 13 in Antioch. They cause a stir and they get run out of town. Same old, same old. Now, it does say that before they have to leave, they remain there for a long time despite the opposition. Now, this says something about just the character of Paul and Barnabas, how into the Gospels they are, how dedicated they are to their mission, that even though they have all this opposition and things are not going well, they stay for a long time. Now, you'll notice here in chapter 14, we do not get exact time frames for how long any of this is taking. Months, weeks, we don't know. The author does not have those details, and so those details are not shared. We just know it's for a long time. Now, they do eventually leave when they hear that there is a threat of them being stoned. And so they leave then. However, as we're going to read here in a bit, Paul gets up being stoned anyway, but this time they decide to leave. All right. In verses 8 through 18, there is this pretty hilarious episode of mistaken deity in Lystra. So they have left Iconium, they go to Lystra, and in Lystra, Paul heals a person who hadn't been able to walk, and then they're able to walk, person jumps up. And the crowd that sees this loses their minds. And they think, oh my gosh, the gods are with us. Look at what just happened. And so they come up with this thing. And you can imagine this happening in the moment without like any pre-planning, and things are just chaotic. And someone shouts, oh, that guy must be Zeus. And they're like, Zeus, 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 Zeus. And they're like, oh, that other guy, he talks a lot. He must be Hermes, 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 Hermes. So anyway, it's hilarious to me to envision this, and also this Paul and Barnabas reaction. So the crowd thinks Barnabas is Zeus, the kind of leader of the Greek pantheon of gods, and here's a classical picture of Zeus looking all mighty and all beardy as well. They think Paul is Hermes. Now, Hermes was the messenger of the gods in the Greek pantheon. He has a winged shoes and helmet to help him fly around, bringing these messages from gods to mortals. Now, you might also recognize Hermes because I don't know if FTD Floral is still a thing, but if it is, their logo is Hermes. There you see that logo. In the Roman pantheon, Hermes is renamed Mercury. And no, not Freddie Mercury, although Love Queen, great band. Freddie Mercury, great singer. The reason he chose the name Mercury is because he wanted to be, a great voice and sing great songs and all that. But anyway, none of that matters. Mercury, Hermes, Zeus, none of that matters because it's just old Barnabas and Paul. Now, in verse 13, there is a temple to Zeus there in Lystra, and the priest comes out and just goes along with it and has like oxen and flowers to make a sacrifice because, if your God really shows up, you better not show up empty-handed. Okay. And Paul and Barnabas are just appalled. Like, you can just imagine the look on their faces. Like, this is 100% not what we're going for. This is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do here, folks. And they rip their clothes. And Paul gives this speech saying, we've come to do the opposite, to tell you about the one true God who made everything, and to tell you about this good news that you don't have to worship these idols anymore. In verse 16, Paul says something really interesting about other faiths and religious systems. And, you can imagine all this is happening in the moment. Paul didn't have this thought out. He's probably just responding off the cuff, or maybe he's saying something deeper here. I don't know. I have no answers about verse 16, just a lot of questions for all of us to sit with. Because in verse 16, Paul says that the time has passed when God was allowing people all over the world to pursue their own ways. You could interpret that as having their own faiths and religions and gods and all that sorts of things. But that time has passed. And again, I don't have any deep insight into this, but it's really just an interesting verse for us to think with, coming here out of the mouth of Paul. In verse 17, following on that, Paul says, but even that, there are signs of God everywhere, in creation, in the rains, in the weather, in the seasons, in the food, and just in human joy, that all these things are universal signs of God and God's goodness and God's creation. Okay. So Paul says that. Now, none of that matters. The crowd gets all worked up. People then come from Antioch to get the crowd saying, oh, these guys are bad news. They're impersonating gods. They're probably saying all sorts of horrible things. And Paul this time gets stoned. And they drag what they assume to be his corpse out of the city. However, thankfully, the story goes on. Paul is indeed not dead. We unfortunately don't get a description of how bad his injuries were. We can assume it was pretty bad if the crowd thought he was dead, but he's carried out, surrounded, and they move on. Now, here's the map again. So in the journey here, they leave Lystra, they go to Derbe. They're in Derbe for a while doing their thing. Then they go back to Lystra, where the stoning just happened. And again, it says they're in Derbe for a while, apparently long enough that things calm down. We don't get a description of what happens in Lystra. If they're like, wait a minute, we thought we killed you and now you're back. We don't get those details. But anyway, you can imagine the things happening on this journey, because they're in Derbe, they go back to Lystra where the stoning just happened. Then they go to Iconium where they had just left because they had been threatened to be stoned. Then they go to Antioch where the people that came from that led the stoning in Lystra, they've been to all these places. They do not have good reputation. Bad things have happened, but they go back there anyway. All this is a sign of Paul and Barnabas' dedication to the good news, to the gospel, and proclaiming it no matter what. In verse 22, there are some words for the church leaders, where Paul says that it is through persecution we enter the kingdom of God. Now, we got to be careful how we understand this. Jesus says many similar things, the best in the Gospels, the best example being John 16:33, where he says, in the world you will have trouble, but be brave, I have overcome the world. Now, this is Jesus not saying these things have to happen. Jesus is saying these things will happen, particularly to that first generation of disciples. And he was right. And we see this in Acts, that these first disciples face a lot of persecutions. And they stoned Stephen and he died. They stoned Paul. He lived. Just bad things are going to happen. Paul gets thrown in prison later on in the story. But again, this is a statement of the reality of that context. It is not saying that you have to face persecutions to get to heaven or enter the kingdom of God or be saved or anything like that. In fact, if we think that, we're kind of downplaying everything about Jesus. Because one of the things we learn from Jesus is that the work has been done. Through the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, all that needs to be done has been done. Because Jesus suffered, no one else has to suffer. Now, we still make each other suffer because we're humans and we're sinful and our systems are broken and we love persecuting each other, but we don't have to do that. We choose to do that. So just make sure you're hearing the words from Paul here right. He's saying these persecutions are happening, but they don't have to happen. Jesus has shown us the better way where we don't have to persecute each other for any reason ever again. All right. That being said, back to Acts chapter 14. In verse 23, they establish leaders in all the churches, appointing elders, and they pray and they fast, and then they head back. They head back to Antioch in Syria. They go through a few other places, and then the first missionary journey is done. They're back in Antioch. They tell the story. They hang out there for a while, and they tell the story. They're like, hey, we went to all these places, and it wasn't just people like us that are Jewish that believed. Lots of Gentiles are getting on board with this. And it's this question about people who are Gentiles, who aren't Jewish, joining the church, joining the Jesus movement, that leads us into chapter 15. Because in chapter 15, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, the disciples, the big guys, they got to weigh in on what to do about all these Gentiles joining the church. All right. Thanks for watching. Keep watching to check out what happens in Acts chapter 15. It's a big deal with the council in Jerusalem. Take care.